Thank you for joining us for the Lifelong Learning at Home series presented by the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning. For over 20 years, the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning has been offering unique adult learning opportunities on Laurier's Waterloo and Brantford campuses. Our non-credit courses are intended for personal interest and self-education. We're pleased to offer you this opportunity to learn from your own home and are excited to be joined today by Jack Jackowitz. Jack Jackowitz was born and raised in Brantford. His interest in the history of the city and the country began with his father's stories about growing up in Brantford. Jack began working as an artist after spending 30 years specializing in marketing, client relationship management, and software development. His art focuses on images of our built heritage. Jack began writing a history column for Be Seen, a local Brantford arts and entertainment paper. Studying history helps him learn about the origin of our community. It helps him to discover the soul of our community. Jack attended North Park Collegiate in Brantford and graduated from Wilfrid Laurier University with a degree in business administration. Jack self-published his first book, The Places We Live, Geneva, New York, in 2012, and has since published 6 more titles. Thank you for joining us today, Jack. We will now turn it over to you for your lecture on the Grand River Navigation Company.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here, and good day to everyone who is participating in this webinar. What I found interesting is I always known that Brantford had a canal and a waterway that connected it with the wider world, to Lake Erie and the wider world. But as I started writing articles for a local paper in town, Be Seen, and started talking to people and getting some of their feedback, what I learned is that most people had no idea that Brantford had a canal, and that the waterway, the Grand River waterway, was navigable between downtown Brantford and the wider world. I think they always thought that waterway along Greenwich Street in Brantford in Eagle Place was just a ditch, just a catch basin. So I started to investigate more about, or learn more about the Grand River Navigation Company, which was a company that was set up in order to develop this waterway. Let me give you some background first on what happened in the late 18th century and early 19th century in Upper Canada, as this area was well known. It was a wilderness area. It was very difficult to access this area. So most of the settlement that initially took place, most of the immigrant settlement, that is a European settlement that took place along the coast of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. It was very difficult to get inland. And yes, you could go up the river, you could go up the Grand River and a few other rivers a ways, but they weren't, you couldn't get that far and they weren't navigable. So it was really difficult to move people and their belongings into the interior of the province. And then over time, it became difficult to move their bounty from the land. That is, as the farmers grew surplus wheat and produce, it was difficult to move it to market because you were situated inland. Unlike the Haudenosaunee, who had originally settled this area after the Haldimand Proclamation, they didn't trade as the Europeans traded. That is, they didn't worry about getting everything that they had all the way to Europe or another market. They had intermediaries that perhaps took their the furs or however they helped the Europeans and move it out to market. So in order to develop what they called the hinterland and to tame the wilderness, as the colonizers would have framed it, they needed methods to get people further inland in the country. Now, the War of Independence in the United States was settled in 1783, and what that created was an influx of settlers from the United States into what is now Ontario and in Quebec, and that is simply because these people were loyal to the Crown. We often refer to them as United Empire Loyalists. So when the American colonies separated, they had no interest in being an American. They still wanted to be under the Crown. So they started to move north. So initially when they moved north, they moved into Eastern Ontario. And most of them who were English-based did not want to move in Quebec because it was a different society in Quebec. It was a French-based society with French customs and French rules. So they opened up Ontario. Haldimand opened up Ontario for people to start to colonize and start to immigrate to. And they first started in Eastern Ontario because the colony was administered out of Montreal, and so that was the closest place where the development of the Canadian province had already taken place. Then there was slowly a migration westward. And so when the Haldimand Tract was given to the Haudenosaunee people, there were virtually no white settlers in this area at all. There was a few, there were some settlements around Niagara, and there was a fort in Detroit, but Western Ontario, as it's known at that time, was just a wilderness. So how do you get people into a wilderness area? And roads were really, really poor, and the technology to build roads was poor. So you relied on waterways, and of course that's what the voyageurs did when they were traversing the continent, moving furs back and forth. So in the late 1700s, early 1800s, what was sweeping Europe and then migrated to North America was what was called canal fever, where the answer to opening up the interior of any land was to build canals, to whether you would make a river navigable or you would just dig a ditch and you would build a canal. That was seen as a way to develop the interior, to get people in and to exploit the wilderness. So I've given you here some examples of some early canals. The Erie Canal, which was first proposed in the 1780s, didn't start to be built until 1817. And then the Lachine Canal through Montreal, which was first conceived by the French in 1689, construction didn't get underway till 1821. And of course, the Welland Canal, which we're familiar with, which is tied to the Grand River Navigation Company, and the Rideau Canal, which we're all familiar with. And there's others that came about too. The Desjardins Canal was proposed in the 1820s around this time to connect Dundas to Lake Ontario. With the opening of the Erie Canal, what happened is that Montreal no longer became the destination for all the produce and all the merchandise moving from the western territories of the continent through the Great Lakes out through the St. Lawrence and into the Atlantic. The Erie Canal gave New York City a prominent position. So now trade was split between Montreal and New York City. And with the English colonizers in Upper Canada, they wanted to retain the prominence of Montreal, and they wanted to have a piece of the business that came from the trade as goods moved back and forth between the coast and the interior. So there was their competition now between Montreal and New York City because of the Erie Canal opening up. The Grand River Valley is an area very rich at the time, very rich in timber and gypsum and fertile soil. And the Grand River was quite a wide river, especially once you get south of Brantford. And for most of the time, deep enough that a craft could move up and down the river. Crafts, I mean, like very simple flat boats or whatever. So people started to understand that, well, here's a way of moving goods and people up and down the riverway. However, the Grand River was right in the middle of the Haldimand Tract, and the Haldimand Tract was Haudenosaunee territory. So as we're going to discuss, that's going to present problems as things unfold and as the waterway becomes developed. In the early 1820s, they did contemplate building a canal between the Grand River and Burlington Bay, basically into Dundas and then out to Burlington Bay, because the trade even in Upper Canada was still to Lake Ontario, into Toronto and then into Kingston, more than it was in this time to the newly founded United States. And as much as it was contemplated, nothing much ever came of it. I believe there was probably a survey and that was prepared for it. I've not been able to find anything on it other than just a mention of it. What really started to change with the Grand River is that they built they built the Welland Canal, and the Welland Canal was finished in 1829. In order to make the Welland Canal work, that is to provide enough water to float the boats in the Welland Canal, because there wasn't enough water from the Welland River and from 12 Mile Creek, they built what they called a feeder canal that went from the Welland River just outside of Welland, and well, I'll show you a map of that shortly, to the Grand River. So what they did is at Dunnville, they dammed the Grand River, and by damming the Grand River, that raised the water level of the Grand River to 9 feet. So 9 feet is plenty deep to accommodate boats and scows and barges, certainly in that time. So that is, as much as there was a thought of navigating the Grand River in the 1820s, in the middle 1820s, the building of the Dunnville Dam really was the impetus to continue and to move forward on it, because now the Grand River was truly deep enough. So the first proposal to navigate the Grand River, that is to make it navigable, was in 1827 when a meeting was called in Brantford. And they gathered together some prominent local individuals, and they also, some moneyed interest from Niagara and the Hamilton area. The chief promoter of the Grand River Navigation Company was Hamilton Merritt. You see a picture of him here. He was the fellow who was behind the building of the Welland Canal. So the Merritt led the charge in the development of the Welland Canal. He promoted the Grand River Navigation Company, although he did it initially subtly. So he gathered everybody together, put them in a room, but he didn't take a prominent a role in it at the time. But he was very influential in government. So he was one of the fellows he was the key individual that really moved this project along. And of course, with the feeder canal that joined the Welland Canal to the Grand River, it was a perfect opportunity to move freight from the Grand River Valley through the feeder canal and then through his Welland Canal up to Toronto. So you can understand where he's coming from, because he's looking to generate more business for his canal. When the canal was proposed, the Haudenosaunee chiefs did not support it. And what we'll find is that they were never supporters of the canal and the waterway. And the Dundas and Ancaster merchants did not support having a canal as well. They were interested in just the road traffic that came from Brantford and London and made its way to Dundas and to Hamilton and to a port. The company tried a number of times to get a charter, and of course it has to be chartered through the colonial government. So in 1829 and 1831, both times they went to the legislature or the assembly to get the charter passed. It was rejected. What had happened then to ultimately sway the assembly to grant the charter was in 1830, there's a Major Eves in Burford, and he built what's called an ark. Now in the lower corner here of your screen, and in the lower corner of the picture, you'll see a crude drawing of what are called river arcs. They originated in the Ohio River Valley and the Susquehanna River, and they were just flat boats that were designed to move goods and people from the Bounty to the market. They were designed in such a way that once they got to market, they could be taken apart, and then the wood and the different elements of the boat sold. So it was really a disposable type conveyance vessel. So in 1830, 1831, and 1832, between Major Eves in Burford and Alobsam Shade in Galt, they had sent down in the springtime these arcs, either from Brantford or from Galt, to demonstrate that the Grand River truly was navigable. Now, those folks who live in the valley understand what it's like here in the springtime with the snowmelt. in that the river rises substantially. In fact, we've had problems, in fact, because sometimes the river gets way too high. But in the springtime, the river rose well enough that these arcs just largely floated down the river. They had to be steered, but they demonstrated that you could get a product from Brantford and Galt all the way to Lake Erie and then over to Toronto. In 1833, the river did not raise. The spring runoff was very low, and the river was not navigable. So what it demonstrated, it was the Grand River was not a reliably you couldn't navigate it reliably, even in the springtime when the water levels were the highest. So hence there needed to be intervention to make the waterway navigable between Brantford and Lake Erie. So in 1832, the Assembly authorized a charter of the company, the Grand River Navigation Company. It was authorized to raise 50,000 pounds. It was supposed to have 5 directors, and then it needed land to build docks and towpaths and mills. Now, in the situation, you charter a company a private company to build a waterway on Six Nations territory. This land is not the crown land anymore. It is the reserve of the Haudenosaunee people. There were plans originally for it actually to go to Galt because Absalom Shade was the founder of Galt, and he was very interested to get the trade all the way to Galt, and he's the one, of course, that sent the early arcs down from Galt. But those plans were abandoned in 1834. But I think as you get beyond Brantford, the river just becomes much harder to navigate. And as you'll realize, if you live again in the valley, that in the summertime the river levels get quite low. So let me show you a map here of the Grand River. So from the mouth here, and as we follow up of the Grand River to Brantford, that's 57.5 miles. That's the distance that the river is navigable. Between Dunnville, where the dam is, and Cayuga is about 12 miles and requires no locks or dams. The water level is high enough because of the Dunnville Dam. Between Cayuga here and Seneca, which is now Caledonia here, this is about a 5-mile stretch of the river. There's 2 rapids, one just before Cayuga and one around Caledonia. Plus the height of the river here, the river rises in this 5 miles 43 feet. So this area required locks and dams to be built to navigate the waterway. So 5 locks and dams were constructed in this area here. Once you got beyond Caledonia, it was pretty clear sailing up to Newport here and then to Cairnsville. Cairnsville is situated right here where my pointer is. As a note, if you get beyond Cairnsville and you follow the river here like this, that's a further 12 miles to get to the city of Brantford or to the town of Brantford to get downtown. And the river here isn't as deep, consistently deep enough to do it. Once you get to Cairnsville, it's for most of the year, it's high enough. So then the proposal was to, once you got to Cairnsville here, is to build a canal to get you into Brantford. So the company gets chartered. So now they have to raise money, and they're allowed to raise 50,000 pounds, but where does the money come from? An economic historian, Harry Clare Pentland, contemporary historian, he described the citizens of Upper Canada as a society of poor men. In the colonies, in Upper Canada, even in the United States, as you further got west, there wasn't a lot of money in circulation. The land was just being settled. So people didn't have a lot of cash. They might have had some wealth because they owned land, and they leased land out or to for people to farm. But even the prominent people like Merritt and David Thompson, who we'll talk about, they weren't flush with cash. So where do you raise $50,000 from? And so even though the company was chartered in 1832, it wasn't until 1834 that construction began, because they needed to find the money, to build this. The colonial government of Upper Canada didn't have any money to say, and it carried a large debt burden as it was, because it has financed other projects in the province, whether they be canals or road building and just development. The Grand River Valley was very sparsely populated, so Brantford at that time had about 350 people. And then there was no settlement between Brantford and Dunnville was at Lake Erie, and it had less than 100 people. So, where were you going to draw from, from a trade point of view, and, where was the, produce going to come from? And it's that chicken and egg situation, will people come before they can get their product out, or do they need to get the product out before, people will come? And then to further complicate the matters, the reason why the land wasn't settled is because it was Haudenosaunee territory. So it wasn't open to immigrant settlement at the time. John Brant, who was Joseph Brant's son, he opposed navigation on the Grand River. And he was worried about a number of things. He was worried about that the land would be flooded. And in fact, when the feeder canal was built, and they put the dam in Dunnville, indeed, I think 1,800 acres of land at the lower portion of the Grand River was flooded, because the river did rise 9 feet. So he was worried about that, losing their land. He was worried about the fishery, because now you have these dams, and so the fish can't move freely in the water. And then because they needed to build docks and dams rather, that land would be, and they needed a towpath as well. Land would have to be expropriated, and of course that was the land of the Haudenosaunee people. This wasn't, Crown land. It was Haudenosaunee land. Perhaps, people argue maybe held in trust by the Crown, but it wasn't open for white settlement. John Brant died in 1832. So John Brant, John Norton, and Joseph Brant, they were formidable advocates of the Haudenosaunee cause to the colonial government at the time. They questioned a lot of decisions that the government made, and there was a lot of pushback, and they could be antagonistic, but they had to stick up for their rights. And Joseph Brant in particular, who was raised understanding the English system of how rules are made, how the laws are made, and how they're governed, better than most of his contemporaries understood what he was dealing with. When he died in 1807, and John Norton disappeared in 1826, and then John Brant died in 1832, there was no strong advocate and strong voice from the Haudenosaunee people to the government, and so they were left in a much weakened position from an influence and advocacy point of view. So to open up and to get work done on the canal, John Colborne, who was the lieutenant governor at the time of Upper Canada, came up with a financing arrangement. And so he took the 8,000 shares that were authorized, and he said, okay, William Merritt, you'll buy 2,000 shares, and David Thompson, who was an entrepreneur based on the Haldeman track, you'll buy 2,000 shares. And he managed to get the Indian Department at the time to buy 2,000 shares using the Six Nations Trust Fund. And then there were individual investors who bought another 2,000 shares. Most of these investors didn't buy more than scores of shares. I think the most that somebody bought was 200 or 300 shares, but no shares in quantity. It's very important to note too that the Six Nations knew nothing about this, and they did not agree for their money to be used to finance this endeavor. In addition, John Colborne promised the company that he would give them 200 acres of land at every dock and dam site. And so so that could amount to over 1,200 acres of land. And I don't understand how Colburn could do that, because it wasn't his land to give. And as it turns out, he couldn't do that. And so when he informed Merritt and the board of directors that they wouldn't be getting the 200 acres of land at the dock and dam sites, Merritt and Thompson said, well, then this doesn't work for us. This investment doesn't work for us, because what's important about the land is that they can develop mills, mill sites where they can charge rent. And they can develop town sites where they can sell land. So there was a whole real estate component to making this whole endeavor work. And when the acreage disappeared, the company wasn't as well positioned to make money on the venture. They would have to rely more on the traffic that would have been generated up and down the river. And as I said, there wasn't a lot of people at this time who lived on the land. So what do you do now? Because the two major investors that represented half the shares all of a sudden wanted out. And so what happened is Colburn directed the Indian Department to have the Six Nations Trust Fund buy their shares out in order to see this waterway get developed. Historians differ on the role that Colburn played here, whether it was he was being, trying to cripple the Six Nations by taking all their money, or if he had the best interests of Six Nations at heart. I think as you have to decide that for yourself, upon reading it. Some of the background material, if you read some of the correspondence, suggests that what Colburn saw this as is an investment where the Six Nations would actually reap a good return on their money. So it was simply an investment, as bonds would be, or the railway would be, or anything else you could invest your money in. So there is suggestions that he truly thought that this was a very good investment, and this was a good place for the money, and they would earn greater returns, because he along with this Haudenosaunee, wanted to become self-sufficient. The whole idea of having this trust fund money that they had was to grow it to a point where they had an annuity that would be used to pay the Haudenosaunee on an annual basis assistance money to help them survive in this valley, especially when they did live off the land largely. So it would help compensate for poor years of harvest or poor years of hunting in that. What's also interesting is I had mentioned that this was a poor society and money wasn't readily available. But one of the biggest pots of money in all of Upper Canada was the Haudenosaunee Trust Fund, and that was worth at the time, I think, over 35,000 pounds. So it was invested in bonds in Europe. It was administered by the Indian Department of the colonial government. The way the money was invested, the Haudenosaunee were not consulted. Decisions were made on their behalf, and most of the money initially was over in England, being used for English purposes. However, it was still their money. So when John Colburn and Merritt and Thompson saw this big bucket of money, it was to them a situation. Well, we have enough money, or almost enough money, to finance this project, and of course it will be a paying proposition, so it will be a very good investment. But because the Haudenosaunee were unwilling investors and forced into it by the colonial government, and the colonial government really felt that the Haudenosaunee were wards of the state. There was continuing conflict between the primary investor of the canal, that is the Haudenosaunee, that the Six Nations Trust Fund, and then the directors of the Grand River Navigation Company, who were looking to get the company up and operating and start to generate revenues on the river. So by 1837, because of the antagonism between the two groups, it came down to would the Six Nations Trust be willing to buy the whole thing out and just be the sole investor in the waterway? And they decided not to. That's not what they wanted to do. But they did decide that if somebody else wanted to buy it, they would sell their shares and get out of the venture, because it was a venture they never wanted to be into. So Merritt, William Merritt did try. He said, "Fine, then we'll buy you out." But Merritt could not raise the money. He could not raise the money to buy the Six Nations Trust Fund out, because just wasn't a lot of money in the area, and people just weren't willing to invest in what they saw was a very risky venture in an area that was very much underpopulated. So we continue. Over time, as the smaller investors grew weary of their investment and the sustainability of the company, they wanted to get rid of their shares. And so by 1840, we have the Six Nations Trust Fund that owns over 75% of the company. So you have an unwilling investor with a large pot of money now owning most of the company, and having no say on how the company operated, and even having no say in the fact that their funds were invested in this company. What is also striking to note is that a lot of the research about the Grand River Navigation Company was done by Bruce Hill, who wrote a thesis on the company and wrote the definitive work on the Grand River Navigation Company. And what he found is that the books of the navigation company and the vouchers and the board of directors meeting resolutions are missing. They don't exist. He couldn't find them. They're not in any archive. They're not anywhere. So how convenient is that? Because how do you reconstruct everything that happened? So as investigations occurred over the years, and as Bruce's research showed, the only reliable documentation was in the Indian Department correspondence, because most of those records survived, and that helped him piece together most of the story. But as we'll find, there's still a lot of data missing and a lot of incomplete records. Then we get to 1843, and by that time, we have a situation is that all the money that the Six Nations Trust Fund had is now depleted. It's all gone. So the way the canal was financed is when you bought shares, the money was drawn in installments. So you didn't put up the full $12,500 for your 2,000 shares. They divided up into installments, and so quarterly or annually you would be asked for more money to fulfill your obligation to buy the shares that you wanted. So over all this time, the Six Nations Trust Fund was gradually being depleted. The Merritt and the board of directors obviously could see what was happening. The navigation company was costing far more than they thought, and they were always behind in their payments. And so they tried to raise more money through debentures and loans, and even getting money from the government, either pledge a grant or a loan, and they were not able to do so. And so the only pot of money that was there was the Six Nations Trust Fund. The sticking point here is that, and it's the bottom point that I mentioned, and this is part of the charter of the Grand River Navigation Company, so that when you bought into shares, this charter applied to you. And what it said is that if you do not continue to meet the calls for money, and that is pay your installment to keep it current, you will lose your investment in the company and all the money you put into it. So, this gets into the situation, do you throw good money after bad money? Is there any way that this thing is going to be a paying proposition? What do we do? And it was a dilemma for Colborne, and it was a dilemma for the Indian Department, because their intention was many people believe that their intention was not to bleed the fund dry. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody believes that. So it's up to the listener here to, to have a look and decide for themselves what the situation was. But they were so far invested into it, and their funds were depleted, that almost they were in too far. Like it was to a point where it would be catastrophic if it failed, and by not meeting the installment payments, it would fail. Otherwise, there is a chance that the company could start to be a revenue producing company. So work finally starts on the canal in 1834. 5 locks were built, I said, between Caledonia and Cayuga. The locks were 116 feet by 32 feet, and they're only about 2.5 to 3 feet deep. And each lock had a lift of about 9 feet. So if there's 43 feet rise in water and there's 5 locks, it's about 9 feet. So you're in the 1830s. Canal construction in North America is still a relatively new industry. So the contractors who won the contracts to build the canals didn't have a lot of experience. In fact, I don't think any of them had any experience in building canal. They could build things, but they didn't have knowledge to build the canal. They didn't have the technology we do today to understand the ground and to do core samples and to understand the terrain that they're working with. So what we had a situation is that the cost to build the canal was greater because they encountered problems in different areas. Indiana was a particularly difficult place to build. Then we also had a cholera epidemic that swept through the valley in the 1834 when they were building the canal. So all of a sudden they didn't have the workforce that they thought that they would have. As you can see there in the point, the company was always struggling to get money and to keep up with the demands of the construction and unforeseen costs that they had to incur. So they were late in paying their contractors. And in 1834, there was a fall flood that damaged many of the works that were near completion at the time. The canal was supposed to be built in 1834 and ready for passage in 1835. They did open the canal in 1835, but all the locks weren't complete, the dams were complete. But I think what the company felt is what they had to do is they have to start to generate some revenue, from this endeavor in order to raise more money, but to pay off the contractors. Finally, in 1836, all the locks and dams were completed, and so the company was able to open up the canal all the way through. But the towpaths still took a while to build. So between Cayuga and Gainesville, that whole towpath, which was needed to pull the barges upriver, wasn't completed till 1840. And between Cayuga and Dunnville, they didn't complete those towpaths till 1843. And in fact, it was the colonial government who paid to have those completed. So at least that whole portion of the canal, of the waterway, would be fully ready and fully serviceable. So in this diagram here, what I'm showing you is the area between Cayuga here at the bottom and Caledonia here at the top. And you can see the 5 dams and locks that were built along the riverway. So in Indiana was a community. I think it had peaked at a few hundred people. It does not exist at all anymore. It is totally gone. There's no trace of Indiana except for the mansion that David Thompson built called the Ruthven. And then Mount Healy is another site. York, Sims Lock, which was never more than just a lock and a dam, so it was never a settled site. And then we had a lock and dam at Seneca here, and Lock and Dam at a place what they called Oneida. And then those two communities were merged to form Caledonia, which exists in this part here. So operations of the canal. So as they really started to get underway in 1835, 1836, what they decided to do was set the tolls as low as possible to get people to use the route. And for 5 years, they didn't adjust the tolls at all. In hindsight, what we learned from it is that the tolls were set so low that they weren't even high enough to cover the operating expenses, or just barely covered the operating expenses of the company, let alone continue to develop the endeavor and to try to pay any sort of dividend on the investment. And then when in 1840, when they had to look at the tolls again, they reduced the tolls in half. So they cut them further. Now, what we'll see in a chart in a bit is what happened to the revenues when they did that. And by 1840, even when they cut the tolls in half, the shipments and the revenue did rise substantially. So the area was becoming more developed. Brantford was becoming bigger, and so there was more traffic on the waterway, and it was a good deal to start to ship your produce down the waterway. However, between 1842 and 46, the tolls were raised every year, so that certainly helped the financial situation of the company. Now, I've read that there was an unwillingness by the farmers and merchants to use the waterway, and they preferred a land route. And I read that in a couple articles that I found on the navigation, but I can't substantiate that. I don't know what the source is and where they came to that conclusion. And although it might be true, what the trouble I have with it is that the roads in this area were terrible. They were just awful. And it's very expensive to ship things by road as opposed to water. Water is by far cheaper. So why they would choose a road that would be 4 to 5 times more costly to move their goods, and that would be in terrible shape most of the year, I find perplexing. So I don't understand how the writers came up with this as a reason why the Grand River Navigation Company didn't do so well. I do think that perhaps the situation was simply that the company was really operated to the benefit of the directors more than it was operated to the benefit of the investors. And perhaps the merchant class and the farmers understood that, and maybe they saw it as a shady type operation, and maybe there was some reluctance to use the company or to support the company. Also, there just wasn't a lot of people in this area. So, traffic was still, relatively small to support such an undertaking, this canal undertaking. So we have a situation where to be a director, you have to own some shares in the navigation company, but you didn't have to own many. You only had to own 1 share. So the directors of the company were ultimately the merchants and the millers who used the company. So it was in their best interest to keep the tolls as low as possible, so they could move their goods as cheaply as they possibly could. But that didn't help the investors, which was mostly now the Six Nations Trust Fund, earn a dividend and earn a return on their investment. And it also made it very difficult for the company to maintain their operations and pay for the upkeep of the canal. And as one particular investor, so the fellow I mentioned who built Ruthven, the mansion at Ruthven, which still exists today as a National Historic Site, David Thompson, he was the worst offender of all the directors. So he manipulated the other directors into forgiving all the tolls that he would have to pay for flour produced at his mills. So the way the company generated revenue was you could build mills along the water course, and they would charge you for the hydraulic rights to power your mills. So Thompson didn't pay that hydraulic fee to operate his mills that produced flour and whiskey. And then he felt that because wheat on the canal had already paid a toll to get to its destination, and he used that the wheat to fatten his pigs at his distillery, that he shouldn't have to pay tolls moving his pork on the waterway. And in addition, because he lived at Lock Number 1 in Indiana, he also got them to agree that he could use that lock for free as much as he wanted to for the services that he rendered, in compensation for the services that he rendered to the company. So it really was here somebody really taking advantage of the company for their own personal gain, really diverting money that should have been the company's money into their own pockets. We discussed how the Six Nations were put in a precarious position because their interests were not supported by the board at all. And the Indian Department represented their interests. So the Indian Department had one seat on the board. And through much of this time, the president of the company, who was elected from the board members, was the Indian Department representative. So this put the representatives of the Haudenosaunee in a very bad situation, because on the one hand, he's the president of the company looking to do the best as possible for the company. On the other hand, he has to look after the interest of the Six Nations Trust Fund, because that's his responsibility as the head of the Indian Department. And as you start to read through the correspondence of the board, you will start to see that there will be contradictory proposals and supports by the president of the company, who was at the same time the Indian Department representative. So truly a conflict of interest there. In addition, the Indian Department was responsible for all aspects of the First Nations people in Upper Canada. So the task was huge, and the department was small. And this investment in this company was just one little aspect of what they were responsible for. So it just became overwhelming to be on top of everything that was happening at the Grand River Navigation Company. And then in 1847, there was a depression, that swept the colonies, and then traffic declined dramatically. So how did the company earn money? Well, by carrying commodities. They carried wheat and pork and flour. They also earned money from the high hydraulic privileges by having the mills built along the canal, which they got rent. And then they also built mills and warehouses, and they rented those out to individuals. And then they sold land around the different mills and that to earn additional revenue. And what were the expenses that they were faced with? Well, the maintenance and repair of the waterway, and then the fixed cost of running it is quite high, and that was reflected in the fact that they had to have lock tenders and collectors, and there was an engineer who was responsible for the maintenance, and then the secretary salary, and then they did have to borrow money throughout the whole period, even though the Haudenosaunee funded most of the operations, and so there was interest on that debt. What we have in the Grand River Valley is three major surrenders of land by the Haudenosaunee to the colonial government. In 1830, which was the city of Brantford, or the town of Brantford at the time, and then in 1835 and 1841. So after 1841, when the Haudenosaunee basically gave up almost all of the Haldimand Tract, the land on the Haldimand Tract, and then just maintained the reserve as we know it today. That then created an opportunity for a greater influx of white settlement into the Grand River Valley. So then what we have is the village of Indiana and York and Caledonia. They were developed by both the company and the contractors who helped build the canal. And then we had Middleport and Cayuga and yeah, those communities also developed because they were on the waterway and there was traffic along the waterway. The company then had mills and factories built where the dams were, and so you can see in 1853 the type of mills and that existed along the waterway. There were also a few factories that also existed along the waterway. What the company started to do in 1836, as I mentioned, is it became regularly operating. So they were moving barges and scows up and down the waterway between Dunnville and between Canesville, because at this time you could only get as far as Canesville. You couldn't get to Brantford yet. And also during this time, the company only ever paid out one dividend, a 2% dividend in December 1841. And they didn't really have the money to do it, but it was somewhat of a measure of faith to the investors and to the public at large to say, you know, we are able to do it. You know, business is going well. Please support us, help us out here. But of course, by paying out that dividend, that just depleted the money that they had further, and that created more problems for the company. So I want to show you a map here of some of the things I spoke about earlier. So this is a map of the Welland Canal. So what's important about the Welland Canal, which actually originally ran through like this, and it came through here. So that's when it was opened in 1829. In 1829, you had the feeder canal here that was built. So this is the Welland River, and the Welland River continues up to here. So the feeder canal helped raise the water level in the Welland Canal so the boats could pass through. In Dunnville here, you can see it's not right at the coast, but it's a bit inland. A dam was built. And so to get the water from the Grand River to the feeder canal, this was part of the feeder canal here. So what happened when navigation started on the Grand River waterway is that when the boats and barges and the steamer ships would progress from Canesville down the Grand River and they got to Dunnville, they would then take the feeder canal and traverse along the feeder canal to the Welland Canal. And then from the Welland Canal, they would pass out into Lake Erie. They did not pass out through Port Maitland here, and they weren't able to until 1846, when a lock was built here to allow ships to pass, and then that provided two entranceways to the Welland Canal at Port Maitland and at Port Colborne. But what you'll also realize is that the Lake Erie is a shallow lake, so it can be quite treacherous lake. You know, storms can brew up very quickly. The water can be whipped up and you get high waves. And so from Port Colborne to Buffalo is a quick little run. And so even when the locks opened here at Port Maitland, I'm sure that most of the traffic that came down the Grand still continued along the feeder canal and down into Port Colborne and exited that way. If they wanted to go to Buffalo, a lot of traffic did go to Toronto, so it made perfect sense just to use the feeder canal because it was a protected waterway. The directors of the company realized that the company would never survive until they needed to get to Brantford, because Brantford was the largest market at that time. So even by 1840, we're looking at about 1,300 people in Brantford. Brantford really started to develop an industrial economy. And what they needed to do was they needed to build a canal, a ditch, if you will, between Canesville and downtown Brantford, because as mentioned earlier, the waterway, if you followed the river, was 12 miles and it wasn't very well navigable, especially when you got into the spring and the fall. They started work on the Brantford Cut, as it was known, in 1842. And it took them 6 years to finish the cut. And of the 6 years, half the time they didn't. There was no construction. There was money problems that they faced trying to get money to complete it. There was problems with you can see the labor problems. There were gangs of workers, Irishmen mostly, and in particular, some from Cork and some from Connaught, and they didn't get along, so there was constant battles, and they couldn't work together. Money was late paying the contractors, which meant the laborers didn't get paid, so then they rioted. There wasn't much to do. You know, Brantford was pretty much still a backwater, so there's a lot of drinking, and so that, you know, creates a lot of fighting and a lot of problems. So it was just a mess overall. And then you have to ask yourself, like, why do you continue? Like, why do you continue building this thing that's just such a drain on money? Because the hope was always that if they got to Brantford, they would be able to ultimately start to generate enough business to make the canal a paying proposition. Because everybody realized, including William Merritt, that the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Trust Fund, had all their money tied up in the canal. If the canal failed, and rather the waterway failed, they would lose everything. So the Indian Department is very aware of that. William Merritt was very aware of that, and he lobbied incessantly to get this to become a public works and to get some help, so that it ultimately the Six Nations Trust Fund would start to earn some sort of return on their money. So I just wanted to show you here as an example. So the river was navigable from Canesville, through this way here. But this was a 12-mile route, and this was a 3-mile route. And you could ask, some people say, well, why did they build straight across here? There is a bit of a rise of land here. One of the reasons why they didn't build straight across is that much of the land here was still Haudenosaunee territory. Brantford, they had surrendered, but this area they hadn't surrendered, and they wouldn't give their okay to have the canal go through their land. So the canal basically had to skirt their lands. And also what caused delay in building the Brantford Cut is the other landowners in this area just wanted exorbitant sums of money, because they, as when a railway comes to town and it has to go through a particular area, you know, the land just becomes valuable because you have no choice. So a lot of that settlement had to be settled through our arbitration. Here's a picture of a proposal of the canal being built from the Grand River and into downtown Brantford. As you can see, that this land in here is Haudenosaunee land, so this largely skirts the Haudenosaunee territory. In Canesville in particular, there's an area where it's a 33-foot rise between the river level and where the canal went. So there was a series of 3 locks here that were built to raise the boats to the level. Here's a close-up of what the locks looked like. There are some ruins of the old power plant that was there, but virtually nothing exists. There's no remnants of the canal locks that exist in this area, other than some debris. And you can find it by going down Beach Road, which is off of Locks Road here, if you're curious to have a look at it. When they finally opened to Brantford, they started to build warehouses and flour mills, because now Brantford became an inland destination to bring your farm produce to. In fact, in the late 40s and early 50s, the farmers from as far away as London would come to Brantford with their wagons to load up on the barges to move their wheat and to have flour made. And they would stretch all the way along Culver Street West, right out, past perhaps where McLean Foundry is today. So Brantford does become an important grain shipping center. Also, flour, pork, and whiskey and farm produce is also shipped from Brantford. When the canal finally opened and the waterway was fully functional, you could get from downtown Brantford to downtown Buffalo in one day by steamer. And it was a very comfortable ride. No bad roads or anything like that. Just sail along the water, sail through the Welland Canal and get to Buffalo. So Buffalo was somewhat of a honeymoon capital for a while for people of Brantford, because it was a way to treat your bride to some luxuries and to have some fun, and the boats were very comfortable to get between Brantford and Buffalo, and they would just go back and forth every day. But even at this time, when the canal finally opened and they started shipping from Brantford in the late 1840s, the Grand River Navigation Company still had money problems. So ultimately, Brantford issued debentures and gave it to the company and said, "Here's 40,000 pounds. Use it to retire some of your debt and then to work on maintenance of the waterway." And in return for the loan of the debentures, which the navigation company had to sell. The navigation company had to sell the debentures. The city didn't sell the debentures. Then the city took a mortgage on all the assets of the company. Interesting note here is that in 1852, the government made Brantford a port. It was a port of entry. And Brantford is still a port to this day, one of the only inland ports in the country. Even though it's not used, that designation has never been rescinded. What's important is that in 1854, the railway arrives, and the railway connects Brantford with Buffalo. And one of the reasons why they built a railway between Brantford and Buffalo is because the Grand River Navigation Company had already established trade between the two centers. And in 1854, there was a reciprocity treaty signed between the United States and the colonial government that allowed for the free movement of farm goods and many items as well. So Brantford had two destinations for their trade. One was to Buffalo, and then through Lake Erie, and then the other one was through Toronto through the Welland Canal. Quickly, we can see the amount of traffic that was generated on the waterway. So you can see where the scows and barges, which is where produce moved the most, grain and wheat, continued to rise until middle 1800s, rather 1850s. And of course, there was a steamer traffic as well. So steamboats represented two classes here. Some of the freight was shipped on steamers, and of course, the steamers represented passenger travel. We can see the revenue that the company generated over the years, and once the Brantford Cut opened here in 1849, it starts to trend upwards, rather dramatically. And of course, then the railway comes to town, and it has an immediate impact on the operations, on the revenue of the company. What happened to the company? The demise of the company. They had small locks. The railway came too soon, so it took too long to build the canal in order to build up traffic. You had a situation where the valley, the countryside, just didn't have a lot of people. So they built a waterway to connect it. So as people started to come, you had this waterway that allowed for shipment both downstream and upstream. As this lock faced the same trials and tribulations as many locks did, or many canals did rather, and that is that they required a constant repair, constant maintenance, because they were poorly built initially, because the contractors weren't very skilled at it. And over time, as the traffic increases, you have to continually rebuild the locks. You have to make them bigger, and you have to make them better, and you have to make them deeper. So really, they got into a situation where it wasn't, once it was built, it could just run as it was. Like once you put maybe railway tracks down, then you have to increase the capacity and the load with which the waterway could carry. So the projections of the business that they could do and the money that they could generate were just way too optimistic for the realities of a area of the country that was still sparsely populated and still had to be cleared out, and didn't have a lot of people to generate a lot of trade. In fact, a lot of the early trade was in timber, and that was because there was a lot of trees in the area, and they were able to harvest them to make way for farming in this area. Company wasn't well run. The directors' interests were not the same as the investors, and it really wasn't managed for the long-term viability of the company. It was managed to make shipping as inexpensive as possible to the people that used it. The government was unwilling to take it on as public works. Even though they offered to do it, as you can see from a point there, it was so onerous to both Brant County and Haldimand County to take it on, because they would have to come up with 150,000 pounds in order for the government to take it over, that they just couldn't do it. And as much as Brantford and Brant County wanted to help the canal, the railway, when they came to town, built railway shops in Brantford. And they arrived in Brantford in January of 1854, and in May of 1854, those shops burned to the ground. It was a major source of employment in the city. So the money that the city was trying to raise and going to use to help the navigation company went to the railway. The company struggled through the 1850s. There was a depression in 1858, which sunk the company, ultimately causing the city to foreclose on the company in 1859. It just sputtered along in the 1860s. There was traffic in the 1860s. There was an attempt to revive the waterway and to invest a lot more money into it, because now the Grand River Valley had a lot more settlement into it. And there was a lot more business, and Brantford was very quickly becoming an industrial center. So moving things in and out through the canal would have been cheaper. The city found that the railways could not keep up with peak shipping periods, especially when you're looking at the farm produce and grain and flour. So the waterway would easily have been able to handle that. By 1871, it was finished. The city sold the waterway to the Grand River Navigation, or the Haldimand Navigation Company. They took over the navigation portion on the lower Grand. The city kept the canal. In 1875, the city sold the canal to Alfred Watts, and by 1885, he had converted it and put a dynamo on it to generate hydroelectricity, thus making Brantford one of the first communities in this area to have hydroelectricity here. Okay, so what we see here is advertising for the steamer service between Buffalo and Brantford. These were mini Mississippi paddle wheel steamers, if you will. They're only about 40 feet long, very comfortable, and they plied the river through the canal into Buffalo 3 times a week. So it's kind of hard to imagine that you're sitting at the library and up where the parking garage is. One of these boats would pull up, and people get off, and then other people get on. But that's what happened between 1851 and 1853. They did run for 3 years. Something also that I found and I had come across is that they had talked about building a canal as well to join the Grand River with the River Thames. And so the Thames goes through Chatham and London and Woodstock, and then goes north. And so I found a report on that. And then based on the report, I tried to reconstruct roughly the route that the surveyor was talking about. And this is what it would have looked like if you consider that here's Brantford right here. And in this area here in Brantford is Brant Park. And then the Five Oaks Retreat Center is at the end of this road, because this is Whiteman's Creek right through here. So this is the 25 and 3/4 mile canal that was proposed to join the Grand River of Brantford to Woodstock. In the early 1800s, railways. In the earliest, there were no railways, and even until 1830, late 1820s, and in 1830, when the first railway started in England and the United States, canals were still the major way of looking at moving goods, back and forth. But this canal here in particular would have been tiny compared to even the locks on the Grand River Canal. So I talked to you about the locks being 32 feet wide, 116 feet long, and about 3 feet deep. Here in this canal, they were only looking at locks that were 80 feet long and 10 feet wide. So very small. It would move, very, very small boats. But it was a way that they had thought of, building canals because they had plans to build canals all over the place. There was even ideas to build, to go from the Grand River all the way to Owen Sound. So that was just that whole period of what they call canal fever, when they looked at canals as a solution to open up the countryside and open up commerce everywhere. I have some pictures for you. So if you would sit where roughly the library is today, and you would look out the back of the library, this is what the scene would have looked like. This was the canal basin. So this is Coburn Street here. And then the buildings along Coburn Street, this is Wharf Street, and it still exists. And of course, you have your warehouses and your sheds. And then this is all the industrial basin, but now where the Freshco and that shopping plaza is in here. And this is, even though this was 1879, but this is what it looked like from the canal basin. So you could still see the remnants of the warehouses and boats on it. This building here, this big building, is called Wycliffe Hall, and it was the YMCA that existed. And this building survived until 1960 in town. And then this building here would be the Merchants Exchange that was owned by Cockship. And this is now where the library is. And the old bridge, the old Victoria Bridge over Market Street, would have been just off this picture to this section of the picture. This is what it looked like along Greenwich Street in 1832. So this is the Scarf Paint Factory, which is now where the casino is. The canal. And this is where the parking garage is now built over this canal. So in the 1950s, they had covered the canal. They built a culvert over it and just put parking on it. And then in the 1980s, they put the parking garage in here. And then over here is a freight yard that the Canadian National Railway used to interchange freight between itself and the Lake Erie and Northern Railway. When this is a 33-foot drop of where the canal exited into the Grand River, and it was harnessing this water power that Watt bought in 1875 and finally put a dynamo in here. So he used this drop and this water power to generate hydroelectricity. So this is at the end of the canal. This was what the old powerhouse looked like. This powerhouse generated electricity between 1885 and 1911. They decommissioned the power plant in 1911 because in 1908, Brantford joined the Ontario Hydro Grid. And over the 3 years, the power from the grid proved reliable and cheaper than they could generate. So there was no need to generate it locally anymore. By 1827, this is what happened. This is a remnant of a lock, and of course it had been long neglected because the company had got rid of it in the 1870s, and the power plant was decommissioned in 1911, so it just was left to rot and finally crumbled and collapsed. On the other end, so this is Water Street. And this is now ICOM Drive, if you will, in this area where the parking garage is. This is a dam that controlled the water that went into the canal basin and ultimately went into the Brantford Canal. And this has all been, it's all sealed up now. There is water that trickles through it. But because we don't have a good flow of water that comes through anymore and through the culverts, it does pose a problem in the old ditch in the canal in Mohawk Lake of getting enough water through that area to try to clean up the Mohawk Lake, if you will. And lastly, what we have here is the Victoria Bridge that was torn down in 1985, but it shows you here was the canal passing under the bridge and then the railway yards. And because by 1850, Brantford was a grain shipping center, here is still an old flour mill at the time. At his demise in the 60s, it was called the Lake of the Woods Flour Mill, and it had big silos just off screen here, and existed just behind where the library was. The definitive book on the Grand River Navigation Company was written by Bruce Hill. It was a thesis that he prepared for his master's in 1964, and in 1994, the Brantford Historical Society took the thesis and published it in a book. The book is available online, but it's only as a used book. The Historical Society has no copies left of the book, and I know they're contemplating reprinting it, but as such, it is not easily available. But if you're really interested in it, this is the only definitive book on the subject, and has a wealth of information, highly footnoted, so you really can research the footnotes and understand from the source documentations where Mr. Hill was deriving his conclusions from. Thank you for participating, and I hope you found this experience a positive experience.
Thank you so much, Jack, for your lecture. Jack has provided some additional materials you may wish to review following this lecture to further your learning. These materials have been provided on the course webpage. We know that learning has and always will be a social activity, so we encourage you to share this lecture with friends and family to discuss what you have learned today. If you'd like to learn more about the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning, please visit wlu.ca/LALL.